G'day, I'm Ian Smith and I'm sitting in the cockpit of my 24-foot Ranger class gaff sloop. And in this episode I'm going to tell you how I built this cockpit, and I'll be covering building the back of the cabin, the structure of the cockpit, scarfing plywood and sheathing with dynel cloth in epoxy resin. But first, I'm going to talk about some of the choices I've made. Up to this point, this has been a very traditional build. I steam bent the ribs, Carvel planked the hull, nothing that wasn't done a century ago. When I built my replica of the racing 18-footer Britannia, I built it exactly as the original was in 1919, and I think that if you're building a historical replica or restoring a historically significant boat, you should keep it as traditional as possible. But the 1933 Ranger is a different beast, and there's a bit of variety in the class. A bit of modernism crept in when I laminated some deck beams and knees. But with the cockpit structure, I had to make a big decision. I could go fully traditional and frame and clad it in solid timber, or I could go modern and clad it in plywood and sheathe it. After a lot of thought, I decided to use plywood, and the thing that convinced me was the fact that most of the other boats in the class had traditionally built cockpits that leaked, and most have had extensive repairs and several have had them replaced with plywood and been sheathed. I looked at the other boats and took measurements, and of course they're all a bit different, so what I came up with is a cockpit sole platform that extends under the cockpit seats, and I played around with the dimensions until it suited me. The two most recently built boats of the class, Vanity and Azure, both have their cockpits at the height of the top of the lower shear clamp, where the deck would normally be if the boat wasn't a raised decker. All of the others have the cockpit about 100mm or 4 inches lower. The grand old man of the class, Bill Gale, always maintained that a deep cockpit ensures that if you're drunk you fall into the cockpit and not out of it, so I went that way. The raised deck means that the cockpit has to be slightly different compared with regular boats, and there's a few classes like this around Sydney, including the Carmen class seen here. The forward cockpit beams form a bridge deck and are supported each side by large hanging knees, in this case laminated. There's a beam dovetailed into the shear clamp aft to support the aft deck, and 2 beams for the aft end of the cockpit seats set lower, supported on added hardwood cleats across several ribs. The sole platform is on beams supported by the bilge stringer. Fore and aft carlins are dovetailed into these beams, straight ones for the footwell and curved ones for the outboard side of the seats, which will support the cockpit coamings. Most Rangers have horizontal cockpit seats aft of a cambered bridge deck, but it's always been susceptible to leaks, so I've carried the camber into the cockpit seats as well. I primed and painted the sole platform structure before permanently installing it, and sealed the underside of the marine plywood with 3 coats of West System epoxy, a couple of coats of Interprotect high build epoxy primer, and then 2 coats of grey bilge paint. I paid particular attention to the plywood edges with extra coats of epoxy, and I made sure that there was a gap between the edge of the plywood and the hull so dirt and moisture could not get trapped there. I only temporarily fastened down the cockpit seat plywood because at the time I did it, there was a shortage of bilge coat, the bilge paint I was using. I just had enough to do all of the areas that would be difficult to reach later. Now, you may have heard me say in an earlier episode that you need to be able to get at the hull inside a traditional boat, which is why all of my internal furniture can be disassembled, and gluing this structure all together violates this principle. Well, not quite. The way I've done it, it will be difficult to get at the hull, but not impossible, as I've left access hatches in critical spots. As always, before taking a big step like gluing the cockpit seats down, You have to make sure you've done everything that needs to be done before they're glued down, and even a few things that would be more difficult once you've glued them down. I had to build a drainage system for the cockpit seat hatches, one to port and the other over the lazarette. I had to extend the sole platform into the lazarette under the aft end of the cockpit with removable plywood panels. I had to seal and paint the underside of the seat plywood and all other plywood surfaces that would be difficult to get to after the seats were on, as well as priming and painting the solid timber of the support structures. Then I glued down the cockpit seat ply with bronze screws in the holes where temporary fasteners had been, and additional monel ring nails, and more on this shortly when I fastened down the side and aft decks. The back of the cabin and the last few deck beams and companion hatch carvings didn't happen when the rest of the deck beams went in, because it was better to wait until the engine went in. All of the back of the cabin structure is Queensland Maple, as happened on most of the class. The first piece to go in is the fascia piece against the bridge deck beam, to which I then attached rabbeted vertical posts. Outboard vertical panels and short beams, and trim pieces. I also fitted the companionway carlins at the same time, being really careful to get the exact positions accurate. As always, I dry fitted all of these parts before disassembling and then gluing it all together. A hanging knee and a lodging knee each side brace this area, which gets highly loaded when sailing. Because these knees are visible, I will varnish them, so I use tea tree natural knees fastened off with copper nails and rod. Then the short half beams were fitted between the shear clamp and the hatch carlins. Next, the side and aft decks needed to be fitted. First, I had to add the inboard supports on top of the curved carlins and add a packer to the top of the shear clamp. I used sticks to sight up the angle of the side decks and faired in the packers, and made certain with long battens that the side decks would fare into the aft decks, that is, so that there would be no bump or hollow at the juncture. The plywood I'm using for the side and aft deck is 16mm or 5/8 inch hoop pine marine ply, the best available in Australia. The pieces were fairly easy to fit. I covered how to determine shapes in episode 14, Bulkheads and Furniture. It went down in 4 pieces, each scarfed together. Scarfing plywood is best done with an 8:1 ratio, that is, the scarf is 8 times wider than the thickness of the ply. Power planes get most of the stock removal done quickly, but you need to finish off with a hand plane. Use the side of the plane to check that the slope is dead flat or very slightly hollow. That is, you should see a tiny bit of light in the middle of the scarf, and the plane should sit right on the pencil line you mark for the width of the scarf and on the feather edge as well. If the plane rocks on a bump, you've got more work to do. Always check with a dry fit using enough temporary fastenings to hold the ply down well. It's best to mark underneath where the supporting structure is for two reasons. We'll be adding nails and we need to be sure that they will all land in the structure, and we're going to use these marks to tape off the areas that will be glued to the structure when we paint the underside of the ply. To keep moisture out of the plywood, we're going to apply 3 coats of West System all solids epoxy. Many boat builders swear by thin epoxy coatings that are advertised as preventing rot. Now, they are certainly better than using nothing and better than most wood primers. But in my experience, these products contain large amounts of thinners, and the process of evaporation of the thinners leaves micropores that moisture vapour can penetrate. And all solids epoxy prevents this and is the most waterproof coating you can get. I've heard people say, but look how it soaks in, but what they're looking at is evaporation of the thinners, not penetration of the surface. Even though some are sold as penetrating epoxies, they don't penetrate any further than other coatings. And if the coating is allowed to deteriorate, it will flake off like any old paint. I generally put 1 coat on first and allow it to cure overnight. When epoxy cures, especially in damp or humid weather, it will often have a waxy feel to the surface. This is amine blush, a byproduct of the curing process and affects all epoxies, some more than others. The waxy surface needs to be scoured off with a scourer pad and fresh water, then dried with cloths or paper towels. Make sure the surface is clean and dry before you apply the next coat, even if this means a little assistance with a heat gun. But don't get the surface too hot to touch or you'll damage the epoxy. Sand the surface lightly to remove any raised grain. If the paper clogs, the epoxy is either not cured properly yet or you still have more amine blush to remove. Roll a second coat on with a new disposable roller cutter. These very thin foam rollers are just right for epoxy. You should get a third coat on the same day, wet on tacky. The right time to recoat is when your finger will leave an imprint on the sticky surface, but the resin is not wet enough to stick to your finger. If it sticks to your finger, leave it a little longer. I generally tip off the second and third coats with a brush to help it level. This generally results in a very smooth surface. You'll need to scour this surface as well before any further coatings and sand it for the next coatings to key in. It's best to leave epoxy for several days before high build epoxy paints or any other type of paint, as the thinners in the paint will sometimes attack not quite cured epoxy and your top coat will not cure or cure very slowly. I sanded the underside of my deck ply with 150 grit and taped off the areas which will be glued to the structure, and applied 2 coats of International Interprotect high build epoxy, and then after sanding with 240 grit, 2 coats of International Bilge Coat. As usual, before gluing the ply down, I checked that there weren't any jobs that would be more difficult once the ply was down. Fitting the engine exhaust through hull and 2 bilge pump outlet through hulls and their seacocks fitted into this category. Stick around for the last part of this video where I'll have more to say about seacocks. In episode 16 I showed how I fitted the underwater seacocks to this boat. These bilge pump outlets will be above the waterline but not by much, so I'll fit ball valves to them. Here I've already fitted the exhaust through hull, well bedded on a well primed hole through the transom, and now I'll fit the bilge pump through holes. Often this is a 2-person job, but in this case I can reach both sides of the fitting while the deck is off. An old file jams in against lugs inside the through hull, and I can tighten it with a spanner. Anything else before I glue the ply down? Yes, I have to drill small holes in the landing areas of the ply from underneath for the nails, otherwise I'm just guessing where they'll go. Now I'm ready to glue down the plywood. I applied lots of thickened epoxy to the landing area of the first piece to go down, the aft deck. I carefully laid the ply in position and fitted bronze screws into the old temporary screw holes. Oh, and I'd already drilled clearance holes for the screw shanks and countersinks for the heads. Once the screws were all in, I added monel ring nails through the pre-drilled holes. Where they go into hardwood, I drilled the depth of the nail. In wide softwood landings, this wasn't necessary, but I did it in narrow landing areas to avoid splitting them. I filled all of the fastening countersinks with easy sanding epoxy and microspheres filler, then sanded it all next day. Before sheathing, you also have to round over any sharp edges and put in fillets to radius internal corners and make sure everything is smooth for the cloth to lie on. I'd fitted a backing pad for cockpit winches each side before gluing the deck down, and now I drilled and fitted 4 bolts right through the deck and the structure underneath. These winches aren't going to go anywhere, even with the kind of loads they're subjected to. They'll be for the running backstays as well as the spinnaker sheet, but they'll inevitably get used for tying up at wharves and so on, so they need to be strong. I had to clad the hull side outboard from the cockpit, which I did by strip planking 75mm 3-inch strips of Australian cedar. Again, dry fitting first, then sealing the backs of each strip before gluing up. You need to sheathe all exterior plywood surfaces. And there's several different types of fabric you can use. This one's a 10-ounce fiberglass cloth. It's actually glass fibres woven in a pattern, a warp and a weft in a pattern. I don't have any to show you, but a stronger fiberglass cloth is called double bias, and they're stitched cloths. That is, they're not woven. The fibres are laid across each other and simply stitched together, which makes them a lot stronger when they're wet out for their weight. We don't need strength added, just toughness and abrasion resistance, so dynel cloth is best here. It's an acrylic fabric that just acts as a matrix to hold a lot of epoxy on the surface. It doesn't add a great deal of strength. In fact, if strength is what you need, you wouldn't use acrylic fabric. For example, you shouldn't use it in situations where it has to span a joint, like in covering the seams on a Carvel planked hull. There'll be enough movement in the wood to likely tear the dynel cloth along those seams.
If you did wish to sheathe a Carvel planked hull, perish the thought, although I have done it myself, use a heavy double bias glass cloth. One other advantage of dynel cloth is that, not being glass, it doesn't have fibres that penetrate the skin and give you that bloody itch.
Another is that it can stretch a little over shapes with compound curves. But a disadvantage is that it moves around very easily on the surface while you're working on it. On simple shapes, you can sometimes stretch it out and tape or pin it down. But on complex shapes like a cockpit with both vertical and horizontal surfaces, it's sometimes hard to make it behave. You'll need very sharp scissors to cut it because it's so light. I did the cockpit in sections. I did the footwell first and allowed it to dry before standing on it to work on the side decks and the outboard vertical panels, then allowed them to dry before working on the seats. The technique is to pour the epoxy on and move it around steadily with a plastic or rubber squeegee, giving it time to soak through the cloth and even to soak into the wood. Sometimes I've applied a coat of resin to the surface first and allowed it to dry, then scoured and sanded it before laying on the cloth. But in this case, I did this only on the end grain because it tends to soak up more resin and the cloth there will sometimes end up a bit dry. A brush can be used on vertical surfaces and in corners. Don't squeeze the epoxy too hard on the surface or you'll remove more than you should. And work steadily, as it's easy to aerate the resin if you work it too frantically, and this reduces its ability to soak into the cloth. Keep looking back where you've been to check for air bubbles that you'll need to work out, and keep checking in corners so that you haven't pulled the cloth out of the corner. On the hatches, I laid dynel strips on the underside of the edges so mating surfaces that will often be constantly wet will be well protected. Once cured, the sheathed surface needs to be scoured, wiped and dried like before. And then another coat or two of epoxy should be applied to fill the weave. Some shipwrights will screed the whole surface with thin filler, but I usually just screed any rough areas I find when scouring and leave the flatter areas to just the epoxy coats, and this is usually enough. I scoured and sanded the final epoxy coat, then applied a couple of coats of high build epoxy to get a good sanding surface before final top coats, but I won't be applying the top coats for a while yet.
There's still a varnished coaming to fit. There's rail caps, trim, and a cockpit sole grate, and you'll see that all in later episodes. But as promised, I've got a bit more to say on seacocks. Episode 16 on seacocks generated a fair bit of comment and made me question some of my assumptions. So I got together in this boat with a few shipwright mates of mine to talk about seacocks over a beer or two. And this will appear in the first episode of a new series I'm putting together called Beer O'Clock at the Boatshed. Watch out for it, and thanks for watching.